Welcome back to Dispatch Faith. I'm your host, Michael Renaud, and today I am with Paul Miller, a Georgetown University professor, and Jordan Balor, a scholar, both of whom have written pieces for us at Dispatch Faith and at the Dispatch, dealing with the government's role in implementing certain values and what Christians' perspectives and attitudes ought to be when it comes to expecting the government or the state to promote certain values in the public square. So, Paul and Jordan, thanks so much for being with us today. We really appreciate it. Paul, I'll just kick it off to you. A couple of weeks ago, we published your essay in Dispatch Faith, ran under the headline, Can't We Vote Our Values? Why don't you just tell everybody the basic premise of your piece and the argument you're trying to make?
Yeah, and first of all, thanks, Michael, for running the piece, and thanks for inviting me to this conversation. And thank you, Jordan, for responding as well. So yeah, my piece, "Can't We Vote Our Values," it grew out of my book on Christian nationalism. Came out a couple of years ago. I'm a Christian. I'm an American. These are both important, but they do need to be distinguished carefully. We need to be careful how we bring our faith into our politics. And the article, "Can't We Vote Our Values," is really trying to highlight some of the pitfalls we sometimes have fallen into. Highlighting that, yes, we should vote our values, we should work for justice, we should pray for peace, we should love our neighbors politically. But as we do so, I suggested sort of three tests or litmus tests to see if we're doing this the right way or not. One is, are we proposing things that are simply impractical? The example I used was prohibition. When 100 years ago we banned alcohol on the basis of our values. It was American Protestants who did that. And it was, I think everybody agrees now, a big mistake. The government is not really good at doing something like that. It's too big, too sweeping, too overreaching. The second thing I suggested was we need to be careful that our so-called values aren't discriminatory. Again, 100 years ago, a lot of American Protestants thought it was really important to their values to prohibit Catholics and atheists and others from public life, from running for office and so forth. And that's a mistake. And the third, and I think probably the more controversial thing here, is when we vote our values, we need to be careful not to violate the proper jurisdictional differences between church and state, between religion and government. The example I used there was the posting of the 10 Commandments in public schools that Louisiana recently mandated. And I suggested that we should not post all 10 commandments because, in my view, the first 4 commandments are clearly sectarian, right? I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. And the government should not establish that. The government has no business, has no jurisdiction over telling us which God to worship. But I did acknowledge the second half of the 10 Commandments: don't murder, don't steal. Yeah, post those everywhere. Those express a universal natural law. And we absolutely should teach our school children and everyone else to obey those universal moral commands. So that was my argument.
Jordan, so you've written a response to Paul's piece. We've published it today at the Dispatch. Do you want to just kind of unpack some of the finer points of what you argued? And I'll say too, if you want to get into kind of understanding, Jordan, you make a point of kind of unpacking this a little bit, but understanding first table versus second table when we're talking about the 10 Commandments, what we're referring to there.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to join in this conversation. I found Paul's original essay compelling in many ways. There were a couple points that I wanted to engage and just think about more. We'll focus more on those disagreements, I think, than the broad areas of agreement. And the main thing, that kind of got me interested in thinking about writing a response was the comments Paul made about the 10 Commandments, the nature of the two tables, how they relate, and then how one relates to the civic realm and how one relates to the church. And so Paul's right, of course, that there is a long tradition of distinguishing between the two tables. The first table dealing with commandments that relate to the relationship between human beings and God. So it's a kind of a vertical relationship there. It has to do with worship of God and so on, as Paul writes and notes. And the second table has more to do with horizontal relationships between human beings, how we treat one another. So one of the things I kind of wanted to clarify was the nature of those two tables, the ways in which they're similar and ways in which they're different and the ways in which they're related. And so the first part of my kind of response was on that theological level. I don't think we want to say that the second table is simply identical with the natural law, for example. I think it is part of the natural law for sure. But I don't think we want to restrict the natural law simply to things that are, well, we might call just horizontal, that have to do with human interrelationships. I think our duties to God, our duties to worship him, our religious sensibilities is part of our nature. And so it's not, I don't think, quite correct to say, not, maybe this is what Paul meant, but it seemed that there was a kind of a divide here between, the natural law being one thing, and that deals with how human beings relate, and then religion or religious observance or worship is something different. Maybe that's divine law or something. So I kind of wanted to engage that and just point out that in my view, piety is part of the natural law, and it's a thing that's taught in a sense through nature and through our human nature, and that in the fact that everybody worships. The second element of my response had to do with kind of the legal claims about the status of establishment. And, Paul, at one point you say that posting those 10 commandments, if you include the first table, is tantamount to establishment of religion. It's not at all clear to me that that's the case. I think I disagree with that. And then third point just echoes a lot of what Paul says about the wisdom of many of these things. So there's a lot of prudential judgment about how we ought to pursue things, and maybe even room for disagreement, and maybe even room for experimentation or differences across times and places, even within a polity like the United States, where some communities may come to a judgment that's different than other communities. And maybe that kind of pluralism is something we ought to respect and actually celebrate.
Jordan, let me, before you guys start kind of interacting a little bit more with each other's points, do you care just to unpack as well for us, as succinctly as you can, natural law theory? I mean, there are volumes and volumes written about natural law theory, but just for folks who may not be as familiar with the terminology or the thinking behind that, what you're referring to.
Yeah, so I don't mean it. I don't mean my claims, at least in this context, to be partisan with respect to a particular natural law theory or a school of natural law. As you noted, it's a complex topic. There's reams and reams of scholarly literature and debate about it. I'm just trying to make the kind of straightforward claims about what we can know about the obligations of human beings as they've been created in a broad sense of the anthropology of human beings that I think we all would probably agree on. And so, yeah, the natural law teaches essentially that human beings have a nature and that it is oriented towards certain goods. The good of obedience to God and all of his commands, and the goods of community that we share with other human beings. That includes negative things, like things we ought to avoid, prohibitions. That's the way the 10 Commandments, at least the second table, are typically articulated, is things to avoid. But that the tradition has always really understood those as also enjoining positive duties towards one another. So it's a really robust, diverse tradition of moral reflection. And so you can see cleavages between different schools and different theories, but that's the main idea, is that there's a shared human nature by everyone, typically, attributed to a creator who has a will and has a desire and has something that he wants to see accomplished by human beings, and that's why he created human beings with that nature. I don't know, Paul, maybe if there's anything you want to add to that or clarify.
Far be it for me to offer a corrective to a theologian on natural law. I wrote a book on just war, and it's a sort of an intellectual history of the just war tradition. And I found late in the process that I was actually writing a history of natural law reflection, which surprised me. And I think it's fair to think of natural law as, well, it's a moral code sort of built into the created order of the universe, and that all human beings, in principle, can discern or perceive this moral code with training, with the rightly shaped intellect can apprehend the natural law. It's not just anybody looking inside themselves, and that this moral code applies to all human beings across lines of time and culture and difference. I think that's a good understanding of natural law, and that means that when we Christians talk about natural law, we're talking about moral rules, moral code that applies to non-Christians too, and that we think non-Christians can also agree to, or they can discern that. And indeed, that's sort of part of my argument about the second table. The second table of the Ten Commandments is not unique to the Bible. Basically, every religion, every civilization, every culture has a version of "thou shalt not murder," "thou shalt not lie," "thou shalt not commit adultery." They define adultery differently, but that's the point: is that we can in public teach these things, and it's not theocracy. That's why it's important for us as Christians to cultivate an awareness of natural law, because that's the moral basis for governing in a pluralistic society.
Well, Paul, it kind of segues into one of the questions I wanted to put to you, which is in Jordan's argument. He kind of critiques the idea of separating the first table from the second table, maybe in at least the way that you seem to do in writing, maybe even the way you described it there. But Jordan writes, pagans as well as Jews and Christians have recognized the fundamental duties of religion relate first to the divine and secondly to humanity, and references Cicero and making that point. I'm just wondering what you make of Jordan's kind of parsing of your I don't know,
Yeah.
separation of certain elements of the Decalogue of the Ten Commandments.
So I think we're probably more in agreement than not here. Theologically, I agree that there is a unity to the Decalogue, that there's a purposeful continuity between the two tables, and that indeed the Decalogue we should understand it to speak to the human heart across all 10 commandments. The point I'm making is that civil government relates differently to the two tables.
Yeah.
There is a theological unity, and there is a political difference that we need to keep in mind. And I suspect, Jordan, you probably agree with that as well. Is this a good time to talk about establishment, or should I hold off on that?
I think that's a great question, because it seems like one of the hinge points for both of your arguments really comes down to what is establishment, and the courts have not had the same answer to that question at all times within our republic.
Yeah, yeah. First Amendment jurisprudence is a mess, and you can find a Supreme Court case that supports any argument you want to advance. Jordan, you said that a kind of a general piety is part of natural law, that nature teaches us to be pious and humble before God or the gods. And I think I can agree with that, but that's not what the first table says, right? The first table is spoken in the name of Yahweh, of God's personal covenant name. The first commandment doesn't say, you shall be pious and humble before nature and nature's God. Right. If it did, I think we could probably put that on the classroom wall, sure. Okay. But it says, I am the Lord your God. I am Yahweh your God. And for the state, for Caesar to put that on the wall of his buildings, I think that is establishment. That's Caesar saying, this is the personal God I recognize, and I am urging you to recognize him as well. That is state-sponsored religion, and I believe violates the First Amendment. But more importantly than violating the First Amendment, I think it simply violates the natural limitation to government's jurisdiction. Government should not be telling us which God to worship.
Yeah, and I suppose this is a bit where our disagreement flows into more prudential judgments about that. So, I mean, I respect that you're making that you're making that judgment on the basis of principle. So I don't want to say it's not about principles at all. And I want to agree that there are ways in which the government could violate those kinds of limitations, those kinds of rightfully articulated and recognized limitations. There's a way you could post the Ten Commandments, I think, that would violate the Establishment Clause, or there's a way you could treat specific claims of revelation that are in the Bible or other scriptures that would violate establishment. It's just not obvious to me that simply posting them as such as an act is definitely the dividing line. If you look at the way the law is written in Louisiana, it's definitely framed historically. We're going to get into some discussions here about, sort of civil religion versus history and historic value and original, the original situation of things in the United States and at the time of the founding and so on. So there's an important theological and principled distinction and discussion to be had here about what the state ought to do and what the church ought to do and how they ought to respect each other and interact. It's just not obvious to me that simply posting something that even has more specificity maybe than simply a kind of general piety to the divine is by itself necessarily an establishment of religion. It could be that it's a pedagogical tool to teach about a document that is important to the American tradition, to understanding the kinds of claims that motivated the founders, that motivated the earliest generations of Americans. So it could be that, right? I don't think that recognizing the difference that the way the government, the civil government relates to the first table versus the second table, and the church relates to both tables, requires that the government be silent about matters that might pertain to the first table, and that the church be silent about matters that pertain to the second table. And I don't think those things are true. And so I think it's appropriate in a public school setting to talk about religions, certainly, and even specific religions and what they've taught, and the way that those religious traditions have informed American history. I don't think that rises to the level of establishment that would be violative of the First Amendment.
Let me ask both of you. I mean, Jordan, you sort of unpacked this a little bit. I mean, I think you both agree that coercion is not on the offing and what we want to be aiming for. And Paul, you wrote too in your piece, I believe, that you don't think that the public square should be totally naked either. But I guess for each of you, what is that spectrum of coercion to total silence or coercion to, a naked public square? What does that look like? I know that may be a hard question to sort of unpack, but help us think through that a little bit.
Well, so let's take the example of there's all kinds of examples we could pick here. School prayer. I think it's a mistake. It would be wrong to have mandatory teacher-led prayers in public schools. I think the Supreme Court was correct in 1963 when it struck that practice down. I think it would be entirely appropriate to start off a day with a moment of silence to allow students to pray if they so desire, which, by the way, I think the Supreme Court actually struck that down, and that's stupid, right? That is a naked public square. If people want to begin their day that way, let them, right? So that's where I'd kind of try to strike that balance. We do get into some tricky territory. Let's think about public monuments and the use of the cross. I think, Jordan, in your piece, you referenced the Bladensburg Cross. I actually used to live around the corner from the Bladensburg Cross. I drive by it all the time up in Maryland. And the Supreme Court has said it can stay, and that crosses on public lands can stay. I think that's probably the right decision. But I note that the reasoning the court said is that the cross is no longer a religious symbol. It has become emptied of spiritual content, and is simply a civic symbol because it letters all the graveyards in Arlington National Cemetery. That, as a Christian, kind of troubles me. And I don't like the fact that we've emptied our religious symbols of any religious meaning. Now, when I think about the Ten Commandments, I definitely don't want to allow the Ten Commandments to be emptied of their meaning and turned into only a civic symbol. I think that'd be a terrible thing as a Christian to see the Ten Commandments so that it becomes this empty recitation of mere words that are, important in history. No, I think we should protect the Ten Commandments from that kind of trivialization.
Yeah. So as you noted in your opening comments, Paul, we're really in fraught territory here, right? This is highly contested, very invested traditions that people have. This is one of the reasons, that there have been wars fought over religion historically, right? I mean, these are all matters that are really important to people. And I fully agree with you. I mean, I think it's a mistake to think about religious symbols and texts as an either or, right? That it is either civic or religious. And I just worried a little bit about some of the framing that you used with respect to the Ten Commandments and dividing the two tables. That it seemed to me, intentionally or not, I mean, to play into a kind of a secularism that would make the public square more naked than I think it ought to be, or certainly one that is more secular than is required to be in alignment with the First Amendment and the Establishment Clause. I try to conclude my piece of my engagement with a point about prudence and room for respecting differences and coming to different opinions and things of that nature. And I wonder if that's really where part of the difficulty lies is, we're so, and I speak for myself, I'm so inclined to think about what I would like to see in a setting, and what I don't like, and what makes me comfortable versus uncomfortable, and what's wise versus unwise. And I just want to, I guess, put on the table that the space for making unwise decisions is larger than we might want to acknowledge, right? And so something could be totally in alignment with the Constitution, and it's still a bad thing to do for some of the reasons that Paul points out, right? So I don't, you that law that maybe isn't even as nuanced as the Louisiana law is, and maybe not because it's unconstitutional, but because it has they come to other judgments about the likely consequences. There's a little bit of a trade-off here, I think, between giving due acknowledgement to the role that religion plays in society, and acknowledging that some sense of the transcendent, even if it's a general kind of civic religion sense of the transcendent, conduces to civic virtue, and the opposite error, which is, or a different error, which is that the only way that we can live together is to be silent about these things, and the government has to be neutral in some kind of strong way. I'm not saying you're saying that, Paul, maybe you are, but there are definitely two extremes between theocracy and a theocracy of established religion, and a kind of a theocracy of established secularism that we want to avoid. And there's a lot of space for us to try to find ways to live together in that.
Yeah, I think I agree. We want to steer that course between theocracy and state-enforced secularism. I think in the conversation, there's many things to be on guard against. You highlighted many of them. I just want to add that we need to be on guard against Caesar's manipulation of our faith. I think a lot of Christians, when they see public religiosity, just instinctively celebrate that. And because like, hey, we're getting our due, we're getting recognized. Somebody's saying the name of Jesus. I got to celebrate that. And I want to hold up the yellow flag and say, Caesar doesn't always mean it. And when he uses the name of Jesus, sometimes he's talking about somebody else. The Jesus that Caesar preaches is going to be very convenient for Caesar's interests. Look at our government today, and what part of our government do you trust to handle the gospel well and carefully, to preach it accurately? I don't trust our Caesar. I worked for the government for 10 years. Please join me in distrusting it. So let's be careful before we really want to ask for Caesar's help adorning our public space with our symbols of our religion.
Brings up one question that Jordan, you raised toward the end of your piece, and Paul, you and I think during the editing process had one exchange about this too, even in talking. But Jordan, you write, we can enjoy a diversity of experimentation and expression of religious faith in public in different ways in different jurisdictions. What works for Louisiana or some places in Louisiana might not work elsewhere, just as what works in San Francisco might be wrong for Sacramento, Spokane, or Sarasota. The American experiment in ordered liberty manifests in these different, quote, laboratories of democracy, rightly constituted as open and free to such exploration. So, I mean, really getting at the idea of federalism, and these things can work out differently in different places, as you put it, Jordan, different jurisdictions. And I just wonder, Paul, even as you make those comments about not trusting the state, having been an employee of the state for a decade, the state, I mean, in some senses is monolithic, but not in all senses is monolithic. And my local town council may be a lot different than the District of Columbia's council or Congress for that matter. So how do we think through questions of federalism or different places governing themselves on some of these prudential questions?
Yeah, I think I want to express agreement with Jordan's piece here that, look, if there's one political principle I believe in above all else, it's devolution of power. It's shrinking government, bringing it closer to the people. And if there's ways to navigate that, and it looks different in Louisiana than it does in San Francisco, I said as much in my book that I'd love to see a different subcultures, different lifestyles flourish in different parts of America. That said, the biblical political theology applies to all levels of government, and the distinction that King Jesus has drawn between church and state applies to all levels of government. And the Bill of Rights applies to all levels of government. The Supreme Court's incorporated the Bill of Rights against the states. So there are some principles that will apply to Louisiana and to San Francisco. So experiment, yes, but within bounds.
Sure.
Yeah, we're not going to sit by while Idaho declares itself a theocracy and Seattle declares itself an anarcho-communist paradise. We can't do that.
Yeah, I agree. I guess I just I don't think that I think there should be a little bit more space maybe than Paul thinks. And not to say that there aren't prudential, reasons to be suspicious, many of which Paul has articulated very well here about whichever level of government publicly promoting religious truths or theological truths or something of that nature. But I mean, as you might expect, we've been talking about the Louisiana law. It's going to be challenged, of course, right? These are going to be controverted. So, well, I guess we'll see what works for Louisiana. We don't know quite yet, or maybe the idea of an equilibrium that's kind of stable is too idealistic, right? I mean, we're in a constant kind of state of engagement, and the culture changes and people's conviction changes, and so in that sense, we're in a discovery process through time about what this American experiment is going to look like as we move forward through time. So, I mean, in a general sense, acknowledging the boundaries that Paul rightly points to, I welcome the kind of civic experimentation in that sense. Let's discover new ways of living together and respecting one another's beliefs, which includes space for robust religious expression in public, even by people who are in government or governments themselves in certain cases.
Yeah, and I was about to say I agree with you entirely, and then that last sentence there. Yeah, I want to live in a country where we have freedom to express ourselves in our religion in public, and we do, by the way. Like, we have every right to do that. It gets a little trickier when government employees do that. Although, when the president ends a speech and says, "God bless America," sure. And if a president is making reference to the importance of religion in American history, sure. It does get trickier when you have a sort of affirmative proposition that, yes, we affirm this religion, right? You can't do that. So I think you got to make these judgments on a case by case basis. And I just want to, so I want to approach those cases with a bit of caution about government's habit of misusing religion.
Yeah, and instrumentalizing it, right? And I mean, yes. I'm sensitive to your concerns about emptying it of it, having religion and religious references be emptied of real content or substance and meaning. What I don't think that means is that we have to have such respect for religious truths that we therefore have to be silent about them in a state of kind of reverence in the public square, or even the public in civil government. On the other hand, I don't want it reduced to just something like civil religion that's so tepid and broad that it can mean anything to anybody or everything to everybody, right? So I don't know how to parse that. Is a reference to God okay? Is a reference to some specific attributes of that God starting to be problematic? How specific can we get? I worry that kind of rule that you laid out, or that bit of wisdom you laid out about, yes, post the second table widely and broadly, but basically erase it from any kind of vertical grounding. I think that can end up doing the kind of thing that you're rightly worried about happening to religion, that is emptying morality of its grounding and its kind of substantive content. So these are lots of questions. I mean, we're talking about.
Let me suggest two examples, I think, where Americans have gotten it right. The Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson appeals to the authority of nature and nature's God. I think that was a government document. I think that was entirely appropriate. It was almost exactly right. I would love every government on the planet to recognize the authority of essentially natural religion, right? Nature and nature's God. And I think that's in a way that people of essentially almost any faith should be able to agree to that. And it doesn't lessen its meaning or value that we know who that God is, and other people might have a mistaken notion of it. Still, we can celebrate in a pluralistic society the reverence paid to nature and nature's God. The other example I want to offer is this. I recently wrote this thing about President Franklin Roosevelt's wartime rhetoric and how he articulated essentially just war principles. Religious language is all over his wartime rhetoric. He appealed quite regularly to providence, to God, and to religion. But he didn't say Christianity. He rarely said Christianity. And I don't think he ever invoked Jesus's name.
Sure.
And I think that kind of hit hit it just right. It was certainly not a naked public square. It was a regular invocation of God and the divine and providence, and a humble acknowledgement of something higher than our nation guiding our purpose. And we were accountable. We were accountable to something more than ourselves to wage this war rightly. And yet he did so in a way that was inclusive and that all Americans of all faiths could participate in. And I think that was the right way to do it.
So, Paul, I think you've just articulated what I take to be the kind of mainstream, well, maybe broadly Protestant, but I'm in the Reformed tradition, Reformed view of the kind of establishment and grounding of the civil government with respect to God. That is, it's an argument from natural revelation. It's an argument from natural law. We could use that kind of language even, and these kinds of attributes of the Creator that that Paul even talks about in Romans 1. You know, that there is a transcendent Creator God. That's, this is essentially what you've said is I think the kind of original public meaning of religion and the kind of claims in the founding era that the founders would have been what they would have meant by those sort of invocations.
Yeah, and we've certainly departed from that. Our constitutional, interpretation leaves much to be desired. But as we seek to fix it, I'm wary of overcorrecting. I'll put it that way. Just because there's some trends or tendencies, I think, on the sort of the political right or amongst conservatives and evangelicals that I be careful what you wish for.
Yeah, so I think that's the right way to think about it, right? There's some other way, or maybe multiple ways, but there are other ways between a confessional kind of establishment, an over-determined, you could say, confessional establishment by civil authorities, and an established secularism that claims neutrality and all the kind of stuff. So this is what we're trying to muddle our way through, I guess, both in this conversation and as a society.
Yeah, we've heard the word neutrality a few times here, and I've really wrestled with this issue. And I think, by the way, I discussed it briefly in my book on Christian nationalism, and I need to revisit that in a future book because it's not the final word on the subject from me. I want to affirm a limited and provisional kind of cultural neutrality, not moral neutrality, because I don't think that's possible. But I think we need to be careful to not assume that our present cultural embodiments of morality are the final form or the only form that public morality can take. So what I'm getting at is, it's okay for our government to say this is wrong and we're going to ban it. But we need to be careful that the thing we think is wrong isn't wrong just because our particular culture says so. Does that make any sense?
Paul, I hope this question isn't coming too far from left field, but there is a reader on your piece. When we published your piece a couple of weeks ago, there was a commenter who asked this question. I thought it was fascinating. And the kind of the postscript on the comment is, I actually agree with most secular values. So the commenter's coming from maybe a bit more of a secular perspective, but he asks, I wonder how the authors would react if the word Christian were replaced with secular humanist throughout their articles, and how those demanding loving acceptance of Drag Queen Story Hour would feel about the Sons of the Confederacy showing up at libraries to read stories about the lost cause, or why it's considered acceptable, admirable even, for classrooms to display the pride flags, but not purity pledges. So, Paul, I don't know if that gets into a little bit about the cultural neutrality that you were just speaking of, as opposed to, religious neutrality. But that particular question, that was a little bit provocative, but that particular question has come up a couple of times in comments. Just why is it that something that's purported to be kind of secular humanist in values, and I think the sexuality conversations and the things we're wrestling with as a culture when it comes to human sexuality is probably a pretty good representation of that. Where do we draw the lines on neutrality in terms of those cultural values versus a culturally Christian value, if you want to call it that?
Yeah, that's a fair question, provocatively stated, but it is a fair question. And I think that, so the two examples there are essentially public school classrooms and public libraries. And the argument about public libraries is, look, let everybody in. So the Sons of Confederacy, they get to use the library for event space. I wouldn't attend. I wouldn't take my kids. I would pick it outside, but they get to do it. There's even a worse example I could give. Y'all know the story of the Supreme Court case coming out of Skokie, Illinois, 1972, when the Nazis marched the Nazis have a right to march in America. I hate them. I don't agree with anything they stand for, but I will support their right to hold a march or use library event space. When it comes to the public school classroom, that's a mandatory environment where our kids are by law compelled to go. So we should take everything down from there. So no, the pride flag does not belong in the public school classrooms. The Christian flag does not belong in the public school classrooms because there's no choice there. People are there by law. So that's the distinction I draw, not between the groups, not between the ideologies, but between a voluntary space like a library or a mandatory space like a classroom.
Well, Paul and Jordan, I'll let you guys wrap up with anything else that you might want to throw in, or just to conclude the conversation before we end our time.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I'm going to say, just in response to that last question, Paul, it strikes me. Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of by disposition an incrementalist, and anti-utopian. So I'm looking for ways for us to find, live better and do slightly better tomorrow than we are today. And yeah, if we could get more respect for the second table commandments, I'd be on board with that. I could think of some specific commandments, maybe one that even just teaching that, is going to be pretty fraught and dangerous and contested, even if you don't acknowledge the kind of transcendent realities behind that kind of natural moral teaching that's contained in the second table. So that's going to be pretty countercultural, even just that kind of mere morality, you might say.
Yeah. So I think I agree. We have our hands full, even with just basic public morality. So let's not overreach and try to involve the government in the first table. I just want to say thank you again, Jordan and Michael, for the conversation. Thanks, Jordan, for engaging with the piece. I think we're all still thinking our way through these things, and I hope to be working on a couple more books on this kind of stuff in the future. So I appreciate the conversation. It helps me think through it, and I hope it's useful to others.
Well, again, Jordan, Paul, thank you very much for taking the time. Thank you for the work that you do in the space. Help us think through these issues more thoughtfully, more clearly. See their work at thedispatch.com. You can find the Dispatch Faith newsletter there. And thanks for the time.